Hello, this is another philosophy video in a series of videos I've done over the years, going through pretty much all the main subject matters of philosophy from an introductory standpoint. And this is the fourth video in the ethics part of that series. So I did a video overviewing various philosophical approaches to ethics. I did one on what we might call virtue-based ethics. I did one on duty-based ethics. And this video is on what we might call consequentialist ethics, especially utilitarianism and egoism. So there are four basic ethical theories, as I mentioned in the overview video. One is virtue-based ethics. This is actually the approach to ethics that I think is most biblical, most Christian, and in the end, the one that we should center our ethic in. Virtue-based ethics looks at a person's character, looks at a person's intentions, a person's motives. It looks at who a person is becoming, those sorts of perspectives, rather than, say, act-based ethics, which focuses on individual activities a person does. Now, these two can't be entirely separated because, of course, who we are as a person um, implies the kinds of actions that we do. In fact, you could argue that our character is the sum total of all of our choices. Now, who we are is bigger than just our choices. Our temptations, the things that tempt us, are also part of who we are. But I would argue from a virtue-based ethics standpoint, it is the choices we make in the face of those temptations that defines us morally. Not just one decision, but the sum total, as it were, or the trend line of our decisions. The Bible talks about the heart, or which is a kind of a combination of the will and the kind of patterns of our wills as the item of greatest moral concern. Now, duty-based ethics, there are duties. There is love God, love neighbor. This is an absolute duty. But I would argue that whenever we focus on what we must do in terms of our duties, as opposed to our heart and our intention as being oriented around love God and love neighbor, ethics tends to deteriorate when we focus only on what actions are appropriate. Watch the other videos. So you have virtue-based ethics, you have duty-based ethics. In this video, we want to cover the last two of the main ethical theories, which are utilitarianism, which basically says we should make choices based upon what brings about the greatest good for the greatest number. And then lastly, egoism, which is basically the greatest good for me. I consider egoism to be the least Christian and the least noble of all the ethical approaches, but hold off for a moment on that. So this video is on consequentialist ethics. That is ethics first of all, consequentialist ethics are act-oriented ethics because we ask, how should I behave, or what choices should I make? Whereas duty-based ethics says you should make those choices that cohere with what your duties are. Consequentialist ethics says you should make choices based upon what the consequences of your choices will be. Now, no person behaves entirely in one or the other. So, for example, there is no duty generally about picking red or yellow jello, or picking this particular kind of food over another. I had lunch a little while ago, and I had, what did I have? Man, I don't even remember. Oh, I had a hamburger. I had a cheeseburger. So I was choosing between a club sandwich and a cheeseburger. Which should I order? And so that there's no duty with regard to that choice for me. I could have picked a club, I could have picked a cheeseburger, and there would have been no sin involved. And so I decided that on this particular day, the cheeseburger would give me more pleasure. And therefore, I picked a cheeseburger. That choice was a consequentialist choice. I made that choice. It was a very egoist choice, of course. But again, if I'd have picked the club, that wouldn't have been immoral, and picking the cheeseburger wasn't immoral. But what I'm getting at is We all make choices all the time based upon the consequences or what we think the consequences will be. Utilitarianism basically says that we should do that with important moral choices as well. And we'll talk about what that might look like in a second. The father of modern utilitarianism was Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham lived in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And Bentham, he was not a particularly Christian man, but his goals were to help people. And so you might say that he was Jesus-like in his goals, even though he didn't really believe that Jesus rose from the dead. He didn't really believe in an afterlife, as we'll see in a second on the next slide. But basically, Bentham, where was he in history? So in England, in the 1500s in England, you had Henry VIII and Bloody Mary and Elizabeth. You had these monarchs who ruled, and it's good to be the king, right? In the 1600s in Europe, we saw the rise of parliaments. We saw the rise of representative rulers to where the people could actually play a stronger role in the governance of, say, England. For a while, the Puritans, in the middle of the 1600s, the Puritans controlled England. And so, but of course, at first, it was pretty much the wealthy, the rich, the landed gentry, the people who were important, the people with status, the people with names. If you were a coal miner, you pretty much were a nobody in that world. Child labor was common in the early 1700s. So you might have a 10-year-old working in a coal mine, going in before it became light, coming out after it was dark. And as far as general society was concerned, that child laborer didn't really matter. And of course, this is the way of the world. This is part of the effect of sin, I would say, on the world, is that the world will always be a place where the rich and the powerful have privilege, and then there are the nobodies. They're not really nobodies. This is the way the world is. This is not the way God thinks. This is not the way Christianity thinks. In Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is not male or female. God does not play favorites. There is no favoritism with God. And this is James 2. James 2, if a rich person comes into your assembly, don't give them the better seat because they're rich. In God's eyes, they count every bit as much as anybody else. So in Christianity, there are no haves and have-nots. In Christianity, there are only sons and daughters of God with equal status before him. God loves everybody the same in that kind of way. That's not the way of the world. As I make this video, I'm living in New York in 2020. We're in the very middle of the coronavirus. Over 1,800 people have died in New York alone, as I understand it. And let's just face it, if you're Tom Hanks, if you work for the NCAA, if you're Donald Trump, you can get tested immediately. You can get your test results back within minutes. Whereas here, I'm currently working at Houghton College. We had some students who were quarantined. Now, thankfully, their tests came back negative. There might be one person who's still waiting for a test to come back, but it took about 8 days, maybe even more than that. It was definitely over a week that it took for us nobodies up here. It wasn't me, but I mean, it's a couple faculty and some students. It took over a week for them to get their test results back. Why? Because we're not as important as the important people. I saw a GoFundMe today. There was a 30-year-old girl who was moved from one hospital to another hospital where there were better ventilators, and they're doing a GoFundMe for $100,000 because it costs a lot of money to helicopter someone from one place to another, and it was an expensive kind of thing. I'm very much delighted for this young lady. I certainly hope that she pulls through. I do. But let's face it, if you were a homeless person on the streets of New York City, you're not going to be going by helicopter to another hospital. This is the way of the world. This is the way of a world that's been marred by sin. It's not God's world. This is not my Father's world. Um, God's way counts everybody is exactly loved as much as anybody else by God. This is what we learn in Galatians 3:28. There is no distinction between slave and free or rich and poor in God's eyes. In fact, God favors the poor in Scripture because they are the ones who need the most help. Well, what I'm getting at is that Jeremy Bentham had those values. In Jeremy Bentham's mind, the the 10-year-old in a coal mine counted every bit as much as George III of England. They they were should all count the same. And so he set out what he called the greatest happiness principle. And the greatest happiness principle was the idea that England should make decisions based upon what will bring about the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. Now, he defined happiness as pleasure, and he defined unhappiness as pain. That doesn't quite work, I don't think, as we'll see in a couple slides, but he had good intentions, and his intention was that everybody's benefit would count the same. That when we make decisions, the boy in the coal mine will count every bit as much as the intelligent person at the University of Oxford. That society should make decisions that brought about the greatest good for the greatest number, or as he put it, the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. Now, by the way, lest you think that he's some communist socialist. First of all, this is well before Karl Marx, so that didn't exist yet. Bentham loved Adam Smith, the father of capitalism. Adam Smith was a big influence on Bentham. And actually, and this is hard, we have to think back to the founding of capitalism. The goal of capitalism was not to make a few people filthy rich. That was not Adam Smith's goal. Adam Smith's goal was to make it possible for everybody to prosper, including that 10-year-old boy in the coal mine. So we shouldn't think that Bentham is in some way in tension with the capitalists of his day, because he's coming out of the same milieu. Utilitarianism and capitalism are very similar in their kind of attempt to create a society where you don't have the rich and the poor, but where everybody is elevated to a prosperous and happy kind of society. So there's a little bit on Bentham. Before I go much further, here's a picture of the man. He did not believe in the afterlife. And Bentham believed that one of the problems with his philosophy, a potential problem, was the fact that people are uneducated and people are superstitious. In fact, I think that's on my next slide. Well, it isn't. It's on a slide that's coming soon. He believed that people tended to believe in things like, for example, why are you afraid of a dead body? A dead body is nothing to be afraid of. And so he dedicated his estate, I think it was to the University of London, but he dedicated his estate to the University of London on the condition that his stuffed body would be present at board meetings. And so they agreed to it. And so it's not, I don't think it's at board meetings anymore. They have it in a cabinet. That's not his real head, because the preservation of his real head apparently didn't go very well. But anyway, why did Bentham do this? Because he felt like people were afraid of the afterlife or afraid of death. They were superstitious. And so this whole thing wouldn't work, he thought, unless people were over their superstition and were able to actually be educated to know the right kinds of decisions to make. I'm blurring this a little with capitalism because these are things that Adam Smith believed as well. I'm actually, it's not in this video. It's in the video when we get to capitalism that I mentioned about people being superstitious and needing to overcome it. But Bentham and Smith were on the same page on that particular item. And so there's the man right there. Okay. Now, Bentham's philosophy was called pig philosophy or porcine philosophy because he had this statement. The pig, and I don't think he actually meant this, because I think when he's talking about happiness, he was talking about people. But to illustrate the point, better to be a happy pig than to be an unhappy Socrates. That everybody's pleasure counts the same, in other words. So that's where the idea of it being a pig philosophy, basically, whether you're a happy pig wallowing, let's say person, I love to wallow in the mud, or I like to read deep books by Plato, basically Bentham said the pleasure of rolling in the mud and the pleasure of reading a book, they count the same. It's all about adding up what he called hedons. He made a math out of it. He created a calculus, as it were. If you count one pleasure as a hedon, and then of course I suppose you have negative hedons with pain. So when you're trying to decide a particular course of action, you go by the numbers. So taking this course of action will bring about this many hedons and this many negative hedons, giving a total of this many net hedons. And then this course of action brings this many net hedons. Let's compare them. Okay, this course of action gives more hedons, therefore we're going to go with this particular course of action. Tried to make a math out of it. But basically, all the hedons, it doesn't matter what the kind of pleasure is, all pleasure counts the same. And so basically he said that the interest of the community is the sum of the interests of the several members who compose it and their pleasure. So we add up the pleasure, we add up the interests, and we go with what brings about the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. Bentham had a friend. Probably Bentham's most devoted follower was a man by the name of James Mill. And James Mill had a son, John Stuart Mill. Now, John Stuart Mill was a genius. He was a young boy. He was taught, I think it was 8 years old, he was taught Greek, something like that. Of course, his father was very demanding of him. And when he was at about 19 years of age, I believe he had a nervous breakdown. It's just too much pressure. When Mill returned from that kind of breakdown, he was still a utilitarian, and you can read his treat. He wrote a book called Utilitarianism. So he remains utilitarianism. However, he could not fully go with Bentham's way. So, for example, better Socrates dissatisfied than the pig satisfied. Mill simply could not in the end accept that all pleasures count the same. So, I mean, let me just make up something. The pleasure a serial killer might get from murdering somebody simply doesn't count as much as the pleasure of Mother Teresa helping the poor, or something like that. Not all pleasures are the same. So Mill ultimately could not go with the happiness equals pleasure kind of equation. And I would actually personally summarize Mill's philosophy as more the greatest good for the greatest number, not the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, but the greatest good for the greatest number. So I think that's a much healthier version. Of course, then we begin debate about what is actually in a person's good. So, like, I had my children inoculated when they were young, and that was not a pleasurable experience. It was painful. There was crying, but there was a greater good in view, the greater good of not getting sick. Of course, we could talk about pleasure, the pleasure of being healthy versus the pain of dying of some disease. Okay, that probably could have even worked with Bentham's approach. But I think we have to recognize that I'm not going to give any points to a serial killer for the pleasure they get at killing someone. They simply don't count. Their pleasure doesn't count because they're immoral in a dramatic kind of way. And so Mill is much healthier, I think, in this particular approach. Now, let's be clear. Utilitarianism is something that we do all the time. It's something we do it egoistically in terms of deciding whether we want a hamburger for lunch. But I mean, society functions on the basis of utilitarian calculus all the time. There's nothing wrong with this. I've been in leadership for a number of years now. Actually, for the last 10 years or so, I've been in academic leadership for the most part. And leaders of any group have to make decisions, and they're not all nice. I've been part of discussions about um, closing programs or letting certain people go. These are not fun discussions. Nobody enjoys, well, I mean, there probably are some twisted people that enjoy those sorts of things, but these are decisions that simply have to be made. There often aren't um, win-win, all win situations. You have to make decisions. Right now, as I make this video, I mentioned we're in the middle of the coronavirus crisis in the United States, and I'm not. And again, without making any uh, commentary, I know that there are leaders that are deciding: do we uh, let do we let people go into public, just open everything up, and this thing will burn through the American population. A lot of people will die, but it'll be over and we'll get back to business. And then I mean, that's nobody's quite talking that extreme, but some option leaning in that direction. You have some voices in that. Then you have others who might suggest, well, we just need to live in seclusion, and isolation until this thing is gone. Again, maybe nobody arguing that far, but so I'm not expressing this very well. One perspective opens everything up and the economy comes back, maybe, although there are questions about whether it would or not. Others would say, well, let's protect every last life that we can and forget about the economy. Well, there are serious consequences to that as well. In my sense of things, and I'm not an expert, but my sense of things is we're going to have to pick an option that's somewhere in combination. On the one hand, it is important for the economy to be functional. On the other hand, we don't want any more people to die than have to die. And so there is a calculus, a utilitarian calculus that will have to be made because you can't save everybody. And so I hope those who are in leadership will try to pick the greatest good for the greatest number in that particular calculus. It's a utilitarian calculus. Now, the question is uh, where where we get into some thorny things, like if you think about dropping the atomic bomb on Nagasaki or Hiroshima. Um, Part of that calculus was thinking, if we drop this bomb, Japan will surrender and the war will end. If we don't drop this bomb, we probably will still win, but it may be a year and a half from now, and more people will die than if we drop the bomb. And so, from a purely utilitarian standpoint, it would seem that dropping the bomb was an appropriate course of action because it brought about the greatest good for the greatest number. But was it the right thing to do? And so, most of the time, there's a mixture of duty and utilitarianism that goes into political decisions. What are our duties? Well, I think it is a universal duty to protect life. Um, and so there, maybe you did. I'm not going to say what the right answer was. I'm sure glad I don't have to make those sorts of decisions. But there is this tension between, do I drop a bomb on Hiroshima and kill a lot of people who really they're just minding their own business. Their children playing outside, wives who had no desire, men who had no desire to go to war, maybe. Um, so those people will die. Or do you end the war and a greater number of people be saved? It's a difficult kind of decision, and many real world decisions are not win-win solutions. And we have to debate these sorts, our leaders have to debate these sorts of things. Hopefully they have the right values, because if a person doesn't have the right values, then that's where it's just going to all go wrong. But questions we might raise about utilitarianism as a philosophy in and of itself. Like I said, we have to mingle utilitarianism with some sense of like a Bill of Rights or some sense of some universal values, universal duties. Utilitarianism has to be mingled with certain thou shalt nots, um, because otherwise we may end up doing some immoral things in the name of a greater good. So, for example, what if the the hedon count? What if it would bring about greater happiness for there to be a million really happy people as opposed to a billion kind of happy people? This is kind of what Thanos does in Avengers. Thanos basically says the world is unhappy because there are too many people. So I'm going to snap my fingers and I'm going to make half of the universe go away, and the rest of the people then will be happy. That's a utilitarian argument. Um, and Thanos doesn't believe in any duties with regard to you can't take half of the universe as innocent. You simply can't kill half of the universe. Um, he has no duty he has no moral value that says you can't kill half the universe. And so, using a utilitarian calculus, Thanos kills half the universe. Not really. But anyway, so you can see where utilitarianism could lead to that kind it could lead to genocide, right? If we get rid of this group, the rest of us will be really happy. Well, no matter what the utilitarian calculus says, that's not allowed because it's a duty not to kill an entire race. I mean, in a sense, Hitler did that. The world would be a better place if we get rid of the Jews, and so he tried to eliminate the Jews. Again, that's a purely utilitarian approach. It has to be supplemented with certain inalienable rights or inalienable values. What if Torture of the Week or This Year in Genocide were great shows? Man, the ratings are awesome. Okay, we're killing one person, but it's making a lot of people happy. There was a movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the 80s called Running Man that was something like this. Now, sometimes they use criminals, I think. So that's how they justified it. These are people who deserve to die. But anyway, um, that's just not allowed once we have this sense of certain inalienable rights or of certain inalienable duties that we have that supplement or kind of filter utilitarianism. And of course, it seems impossible to increase everyone's happiness at the same time. So utilitarianism, I'm not throwing it out because it is the primary way that the world operates, and rightly so. But it has to be supplemented with a sense of certain fundamental values that prohibit certain activities, even if they happen to be advantageous. You might have heard the saying, the end justifies the means. In a sense, utilitarianism is a end justifies the means kind of philosophy. Now, it works most of the time, but in certain instances, in certain areas, the end does not justify the means. And our values, the thou shalt nots, have to take over. Well, I want to end this video with just a brief mention of egoism. So if utilitarianism is what brings about the greatest good to the greatest number, egoism is what's the greatest good for me. And the name I want to mention here is Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand grew up in the Soviet Union, USSR. And so when she came to America, she went hyper capitalist. And I don't know whether it's completely true, but I've noticed this in others. I knew an economics professor in a previous institution who came from Eastern Europe, and he was very much a capitalist. And again, I'm a capitalist. I believe in a modified or a regulated capitalism, as we'll see when we get to that particular video. But Ayn Rand goes to an extreme with her hyper-capitalism. She would say, she wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. The Virtue of Selfishness. Ayn Rand actually believes that donating your money to a charitable cause is immoral because we have to look out for number one. And of course, before we think of her as an evil person, in her thinking, if everybody looks out for themselves, then everybody will get the greatest good for them. But if I'm always giving away stuff, or if I let people run over me, then they get more than they should, and I don't get what I should. her argument is that we can only maximize happiness if everybody is looking out for number one, and then we meet in the middle where I don't get more than I should and you don't get more than you should, but we both get the maximum amount for each other. And so she believed that altruism was evil, uh, wrong. Again, she's not a Christian. This is not a Christian value. There may be certain practicality to it. And when we get to capitalism, we will talk about capitalism as I'm going to argue that capitalism is, at least if it's well run, that a well run capitalism does maximize certain benefits to culture. But make no mistake, capitalism works because we live in a fallen world. It is because of human self-centeredness, human selfishness. It's because humanity is not by nature generous that capitalism works. In other words, capitalism works best not because it is the most godly, but because it takes into account human nature more than other systems do, in my opinion. We'll get to that when we get to capitalism. Now, John Locke built the kind of structure, and here we're getting ready for social and political philosophy, which are our next series of videos in this series, and including economic philosophy. Locke pictured a system based upon universal egoism. That is, a system that is set up to bring about the greatest good for all individuals. This is a kind of egoism, but it's not an egoism focused on the individual. It's a form of egoism built on the entire system, a system that maximizes happiness for all. Now, again, it hasn't happened. And we can talk about systemic evil or aspects of the structure or the system of the social world, of politics and so forth, where the system is not even-handed toward everybody in the system. And that's simply the case, I would say, that even in the United States, the system does not equally benefit all people. That's not what Locke was aiming for. Locke was aiming for a universal egoism. That is a system that brought about the greatest good for all individuals in it. Well, that's a good introduction for social and political and economic philosophy, which is our next series of videos in this basic run through philosophy from a Christian standpoint.